Okay, here we are, and I'm going to show you how to paper piece the first A block of our $5 Quilt Club month 3. So I'm going to start with, so I have all my pieces. Here's my A4, here's my A3 and A2, and then this is my A1. So I'm going to start with A1. And I'm going to just put a tad bit of glue. You can use glue or you can use pins. So I'm just going to glue a little bit in the center here, and then place my first piece down so that it stays exactly where I want it to stay. And then I'm going to fold the paper, on this one, on the line between A1 and A2. So you can use a piece of cardstock, whatever you have laying around, or you can just eyeball it. So in this case, I'm just going to use my Sew Straight, and I'm going to place it right on the line, and then I'm going to crease the paper on that line. So that way I can see exactly how much extra fabric I have, and that's a bit excessive. So I'm just going to cut that off to be approximately about 1/4 inch. If you want, you can use an add a quarter ruler, so that it's exactly 1/4 inch. Or you can just use any standard ruler, and you just place the 1/4 inch line directly on the folded line, and then you can use a rotary cutter, and just trim that right off so that it's a perfect 1/4 inch. So your block will turn out really nice. It is totally a personal preference of whether or not you want to use an add a quarter ruler or a ruler to cut that to be trimmed, to be perfect. I just use scissors, but any method is totally fine. So next thing I'm going to do is, so I have my, this is the right side of my fabric. It's solid, so there isn't really, a right or wrong side, but I'm going to fold, so we're going to fold the paper right on that line, and then I'm going to put my A2 fabric right along the side here so that it will be covered completely. Oh, actually, I'm going to put it this way. I'm going to make sure that it's covered completely. So if you can see a little bit of the outline here of the A2 shape that is folded. So when it's folded this way, I have to make sure that this green fabric covers that A2 piece on all sides. So this is where a light box is extremely awesome. So you can see, if I hold it up to the light here, you can see really nicely that it covers all of that area. So I know that when I open this up and I press it, it will cover that whole area. So when I open this up, it looks kind of scary, like it's not going to cover that whole spot, but it is. So all of that is completely excess right here. So I'm just going to trim that off. So that is excess. So we're just worried about the green covering this triangle right here. So that's where it's covering. And now I'm going to open it up, and I'm going to slide it over to my machine, and I'm going to change my stitch length on my machine to 1.5. That is my preference. Some people stitch at 1.3. Depending on what kind of paper you used, I just use copy paper. If you use the newsprint or doodle paper, you might not need to stitch quite as small as 1.5. But I'm going to start well before the line I'm stitching, and I'm going to end past the line I'm stitching. So I'm going to start so that it covers the complete seam allowance. And I'm going to stitch directly on that printed line all the way. And then I'm going to stop after maybe 4 or so stitches after, so that my points will be really perfect. So you can see I've stitched all the way before that line, completely in that seam allowance, and then another 1/4 inch past my stitching line. So that is how, when you open it up, now it covers completely that A2 triangle, and it's really nice. So every time you stitch, you are going to need to press this seam. So if you do not press this with a seam roller, or you can't see it, if you don't press it with a seam roller or with a hot iron, what happens is that you might end up having it folded a little bit, and you will need to make sure that it gets pressed all the way open so that your points won't end up getting missed. So if there's a little bit of a fold and it's not pressed all the way that way, you won't end up getting your points lining up. So you definitely have to make sure that this gets pressed really, really good. So I'm gonna pop it over to the iron right here real quick and then stitch the next line. Okay, so now I pressed it so that it's really, really nice and flat. Okay, so now I'm going to stitch a 3. So just like before, we're gonna take, a little piece of cardstock, just so that it's really nicely, and you will have to rip the paper, just like this, so that you can fold the paper right on that line. So now you can see that I've folded it all the way on that line. And now I know that all of this up here, that's my seam allowance, and it's just too large. So I'm going to trim it down with scissors. So that is my next spot. So when I'm going to open it up and I'm going to see, okay, so now I need to do a 3. So I'm going to toss these and I'm going to take my next rectangle and I'm going to place it right sides together with my current project. And that is the one I'm going to stitch right there. So I'm going to be stitching directly on that side. I'm going to trim this here. So you can trim before or you can trim after you stitch. And I'll show you that in a second. So this is my seam allowance here. This is the line I'm going to be stitching on. So I'm going to slide that right over to my machine. And I'm going to start before the line all the way, then completely in that seam allowance. And I'm going to stitch all the way past my line, about 1/4 of an inch or so. And then I cut my threads. And now you can see I've stitched directly on that line. So now we can open this up, but if you want to use a rotary cutter and a ruler to trim this, because if you don't trim it really nicely, this green is a little bit longer than the white, so that when I open this up, you might end up seeing a little bit of that seam allowance under there being uneven. So it is a good idea to use a mat and a ruler. Just gonna stick this under here so that hopefully you guys can see that okay. So I can use a ruler. The add 1/4 rulers are really fantastic because they have a lip on the back side of the ruler so that when you press it against the paper, it just fits there perfectly and it won't slide across. So with this, it does take a little bit more time to make sure that you get this to be the perfect 1/4 of an inch there. So now my seam allowance looks really, really nice there. And now I can open my fabric and I can press this with a hot iron, or you can use a seam roller. So that's just a wooden seam, a wooden way of pressing your seams. So it just rolls a piece of wood. It's like a piece of wood it's like a bead on a stick that you're just gonna roll to make sure that that gets pressed open really, really perfectly with no folds of the fabric. So I'm gonna go press this real quick. Okay, so now I pressed it and you can see how nice that line is. And so now we're gonna be doing a 4 here. So I'm going to again take my piece of cardstock, and if you have to, you will have to rip the paper a tiny bit, but now you're going to press the paper so it will be, it's a little off, but it'll be okay. I can redo that. We'll make it a little bit better. There. So this is a point in which you can go ahead and use this time to trim for your next placement. So I'm going to use a ruler and I'm going to put the 1/4 inch line right on the edge, and I'm going to trim off the excess here. There. Okay. So now I have this spot here. So now I can grab my next piece, which I think I put onto the mat, and I want to make sure that this is going to be lining up directly with this edge here. So, and then I have to make sure that this white piece is going to cover this whole area here. And it looks, this is a little small here and it's a little bit bigger there. So I'm just going to move it a tiny bit so that it's a little bit better centered. Okay, and you want that lined up really, really nice. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch this line here. So I'm going to open my paper, and then I'm going to slide my project right over here. And if you're really worried about sliding your project and whether or not things are going to move, you can pin it so that you know it's going to be really, really perfect. But this machine, the M7, is really great because it has recessed feed dogs. So you're never going to, get done sewing and find out that you accidentally sewed, the bottom fabric flip down. So that's one of the great things about the M7. So anyway, I'm just going to stitch all the way through my entire seam allowance and all the way over to the other end, all the way, staying right on that black line. So that's how I've stitched that whole thing, and we're done with block A. Ta-da! And look at how perfect that is. There's a little thread there, but look at how perfect that is. So I'm definitely going to be trimming my seam allowance because you can see a little bit of that green fabric ghosting through this white. So, and I don't really want to see that. So I want to make sure that there's no green threads there. And I'm going to clean that up really, really nice. So that is how you do block 1. So that's all the stitching. Once you get completed and everything is pressed, so I'm going to press this real quick. I'm going to show you that you just need to be trimming your blocks on the trimming lines, which are the seam allowance lines. Okay, so here we go. Here we go. Now I'm going to flip it over, and I'm going to use a ruler, and I'm going to trim the paper and the fabric. So I'm going to place the 1/4 inch line, oops, there it is. So the 1/4 inch line here and the 1/4 inch line here on the 1/4 inch lines on my paper. So, and then I'm going to trim everything that's excess, and I'm going to do 2 all at once here. So there's one side, and there's the other side. I would definitely recommend using a larger rotary cutter. This one's really little. It's great for curves, but it doesn't cut as much. So it looks like I trimmed just a tiny bit of that print off, but that's totally that's my quarter of an inch seam allowance. So I've got that corner done, and so now I want to trim just on that lighter black line on the edges. So I'm going to place my ruler in place, and then I'm going to trim these edges. There we go. So there is a little bit of waste with paper piecing, but it's totally worth that accuracy. I mean, look at how awesome that looks. So that is block A. So the next thing we're going to do is block B, and we will be right back for that.